The wind swept harshly across the wide plains of Montana Territory in the winter of 1885, carrying with it the scent of snow and the warning of another storm. Ethan McCoy pulled the collar of his coat higher, his horse snorting against the cold as he guided the small herd of cattle back toward the valley. He was only 26, but the years of solitude on his ranch had carved lines of hardness around his eyes. He was known among the nearby settlers as the Quiet One, a man who kept to himself, spoke little, and never lingered long in town. Some whispered he was hiding from something, others thought he was simply odd. But no one could deny he worked harder than most men to wrest a life out of the stubborn land. For Ethan, the silence of the ranch had become both his prison and his comfort. His parents had died of fever when he was a teenager, leaving him to fight the world alone. Since then, he had carried their lessons like chains around his neck. His father had taught him never to trust too deeply, never to lean on anyone, for people would always leave. His mother, gentle but fearful, had whispered in her last days that he must guard his heart against the cruelties of the world. Ethan had taken those words as gospel. He worked the soil, tended the cattle, mended fences, and when night fell, he sat by a fire in a house too large for one man, his only company the wind rattling the shutters. But on this night, as the sky burned crimson with the last light of day, and the clouds rolled in heavy and dark, something shifted. The storm came with a speed that startled even him. Snowflakes the size of coins began to fall, carried sideways by gusts that bit like knives. The herd panicked, scattering despite his desperate calls. Ethan cursed under his breath, trying to hold them together, but within minutes the world vanished into a wall of white. He could barely see his own horse's ears. The ranch house was miles away. He knew the land, but in such a storm knowing meant little. Disoriented, freezing, he gave the reins to his horse, trusting its instincts to find shelter. Time blurred into a haze of biting wind and numb hands until through the curtain of snow he glimpsed a flicker of light. A fire. Hope and fear collided in his chest. Fire meant people, and people in this land could mean salvation or danger. Still, the cold was merciless. He slid from the saddle, half stumbling toward the glow. The outline of a lodge took shape, smoke curling upward into the storm. A native dwelling, he realized. His father's voice roared in his memory, "Never trust them, son." But the storm cut deeper than pride or prejudice. Ethan raised a shaking hand and knocked against the wooden pole that framed the hide flap. "Hello," he croaked. "I mean, no harm, just the storm." The flap moved, and in its glow stood two figures. Young women, dark-haired, their eyes sharp with suspicion. One held a knife at her side, the other stepped forward, her gaze steady. She was perhaps 20, her face both strong and beautiful, framed by braids decorated with beads that caught the firelight. For a heartbeat, none spoke. Ethan knew he must look like a specter, a tall white man, half-frozen, armed, appearing at their shelter. He forced the words past his numb lips. "Please, my horse and I, we just need shelter, only for the night." The younger woman glanced back at her sister, their words quick and low in their language. Then she turned and spoke in accented English. "Bring your horse, come inside, but no trouble." Relief nearly brought Ethan to his knees. He led his horse to the lee side of the rocks where the older sister secured it. Inside, warmth struck him like a blow. The fire burned in the center, blankets and robes lining the space. The smell of smoke and herbs filled the air. His frozen body trembled as he collapsed near the flames, unable to hide his desperation. "Thank you," he whispered. The younger one poured something steaming into a clay cup and handed it to him. His fingers burned at the heat, but he clung to it, sipping the bitter tea that seared life back into his veins. He tried to speak his name, Ethan McCoy, but it came out broken, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "I am Aya the younger," said, placing her hand against her chest. "This is Nashota, my sister." Their names lingered in the air like a promise. Ethan nodded. The words failed him. Outside, the storm howled and raged, but within the small circle of firelight, a fragile peace began to form. He had been raised to keep his heart locked away, but as his frozen body thawed under their care, something inside him cracked open. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel entirely alone. Yet he also knew this shelter came with risk. Two Apache women living free beyond the reservation were fugitives in the eyes of the law. If others discovered them, danger would come swift and merciless. By seeking their fire, he had stepped into a storm far greater than the one outside. Still, as Aya met his gaze, her eyes both wary and filled with quiet strength, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he had long buried. This night he sensed would change everything. The storm outside grew heavier, slamming against the hide walls of the lodge, but inside the fire burned steady. Ethan sat, hunched, his hands wrapped around the clay cup, the warmth creeping slowly back into his body. The pain of thawing fingers made him wince in Nashota. The older sister watched him with sharp eyes that seemed to weigh his every breath. She said something in her tongue, and Aya answered with a tone that was calmer, more gentle. Ethan could not understand the words, but he knew their meaning. They were deciding whether to trust him. He cleared his throat. "I'll leave at first light," he said softly. "Just thank you for the fire." Aya tilted her head, studying him with a gaze that felt too steady, too knowing. "Storm may not stop by morning. Maybe 2 days? Maybe more." The thought of being trapped here both terrified and comforted him. Terrified because he was an intruder in a place where he was not welcome by law or by blood. Comforted because the warmth, the faint smile on Aya's lips, and the quiet strength of Nashota's presence had begun to thaw something deeper than his hands and feet. Nashota handed him a blanket, the heavy buffalo hide settling across his shoulders like armor. "Drink more," she said curtly in accented English. "Pain means blood still moves." "Good." Ethan nodded, obedient as a child. The bitterness of the tea was sharp, but as he swallowed it, heat blossomed in his chest, steady and insistent. "Why help me?" he asked after a moment, his voice ragged. "I'm a stranger. Worse, I'm a white man." Aya's eyes flickered in the firelight. "Storm does not care what color you are. Cold kills all the same." Her words pierced him more deeply than he expected. He thought of his mother's warnings, his father's harsh lessons, all built on the idea that people were divided by race, by blood, by the invisible fences men drew around themselves. Yet here in this fragile shelter, two Apache women had chosen compassion over caution. Time blurred as the fire crackled. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the wooden poles, shaking the lodge as though trying to tear it down. Inside, silence stretched between them, but not an empty silence. Ethan found himself speaking haltingly at first, then with more urgency. He told them about his ranch, about the herd he feared he had lost to the storm, about the 5 years of solitude since fever had taken his parents. Aya listened, her dark eyes never leaving his face. Nashota busied herself with tending the fire, though Ethan noticed how her ear tilted toward him, how she caught every word. When he fell silent, embarrassed by how much he had revealed, Aya spoke softly. 5 years alone. That is long time. Too long. It was easier, he muttered, staring into the flames. No one to lose. No one to disappoint. Nashota's voice cut through the crackle of the fire. No one to live for either. The words struck him hard, harsher than the wind outside. He looked up, but Nashota had turned away, her face hidden in the shadows. The night deepened. Fatigue dragged at his body, but the fear of appearing weak kept him upright. Aya noticed, and with a small smile, she pointed to a place near the fire. Sleep. Safe here. He wanted to argue, to insist he could not burden them further, but his body betrayed him. As he lay down on the blankets, the warmth seeping into his frozen bones, he heard Aya's voice, quiet and firm. Rest, Ethan. Storm will rage, but fire holds. His eyes closed despite himself. The last thing he saw was Aya's silhouette against the firelight, her braid falling over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, yet strangely comforting. Sleep did not come gently. Dreams seized him, dreams of snow swallowing the land of cattle frozen where they stood, of his mother's voice, whispering for him to keep his heart locked away. But beneath it all, another voice echoed, softer, unfamiliar yet insistent. It was Aya's, telling him the storm did not care what color he was, that cold killed all the same. He woke with a start sometime in the dark hours before dawn. The fire still burned, though low. Nashota slept against the wall, her knife still clutched loosely in one hand. Aya was awake, sitting cross-legged by the embers, mending a strip of leather with quiet concentration. Ethan sat up slowly, careful not to startle her. "You don't sleep?" he asked quietly. She glanced up, a faint smile touching her lips. "Someone must watch fire. Someone must watch stranger." Her honesty disarmed him. He almost laughed, though the sound caught in his throat. "Fair enough, but thank you." for trusting me at all. Aya studied him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. Trust is small now. Only for Storm. After, she shrugged, leaving the meaning clear. After the storm, trust might vanish with the snow. Ethan felt the truth of her words, heavy as the winter air. Yet he also felt something else, an ember deep inside him, fragile but real. He could not name it, but he knew one thing. This storm this night had already begun to change him. And as the first pale light of dawn filtered faintly through the smoke hole above, Ethan realized he wanted that ember to grow no matter the cost. The morning light crept slowly into the lodge, gray and weak, filtering through the smoke hole. Ethan stirred from half-sleep, his body aching but alive. The blizzard had not relented. It screamed outside with the same ferocity, but inside the air felt softer, warmer, touched by the steady rhythm of the fire. Mary, the younger sister, moved quietly, stirring a pot that hung above the coals. The smell was strange but pleasant, earthy with a sharp note of herbs. Nashoda sat near the entrance, her back straight, her knife resting across her lap as if she had been carved from stone. She had not truly slept, Ethan realized. She was the kind who watched until danger was gone. Ethan sat up, rubbing the stiffness from his arms. Mary looked at him with a faint smile, and for a moment the warmth of her eyes disarmed him more than the heat of the fire ever could. Eat, she said, handing him a small bowl. He took it carefully, surprised by the weight of her trust. The food was thick and hot, a mix of grain and rabbit meat softened into a stew. His stomach clenched in hunger, and he ate greedily. Mary's smile widened just a little, the corners of her lips curving upward as if she was amused by his urgency. Thank you, he said after swallowing, his voice rough. You saved my life last night. Nashoda's gaze snapped to him, sharp as an arrow. Do not think saving means trusting, she said. Her English was accented but strong. Storm will pass. Then you leave. Ethan met her eyes, unwilling to shrink under her challenge. I understand, but that doesn't change my gratitude. Mary placed another log on the fire, the sparks jumping upward. Gratitude is good, she said gently, but Storm not finished yet, maybe many days. The thought made Ethan uneasy. Many days trapped here with two Apache women who should have feared him as much as he had been taught to fear them. Yet some part of him, the part he had buried under years of solitude, longed for it. The storm raged on, day blending into night until time itself seemed to vanish. Hours were measured only by the tending of the fire, the passing of the cup, the small exchanges of words. Ethan learned that Mary had a mischievous streak, a tendency to ask questions that caught him off guard. Why no wife, she asked one evening, her eyes fixed on him with disarming directness. Heat rose to his cheeks, hotter than the fire. I never had time, he stammered. Not time, Nashoda cut in her tone cold. Fear. He is afraid of women. Mary gave her sister a reproving look but said nothing. Ethan wanted to argue to deny it, but the truth was too raw. Maybe I was afraid, he admitted, finally, his voice low. Afraid to lose someone again. The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Mary broke it with a quiet hum, a melody that seemed older than the land itself. It wrapped around Ethan, soothing, pulling memories of his mother's lullabies back into the open. One night, as the storm clawed at the walls, he dreamed again. He saw himself standing alone in the endless snow, his cattle frozen statues around him, his house buried under drifts. Then Mary appeared, her braid trailing behind her, her eyes filled with firelight. She reached out a hand, and when he took it, the snow melted under his feet, revealing green grass. He woke with a start, his breath ragged. Mary was sitting across the fire, awake as always, her eyes fixed on him. Bad dream, she asked softly. He nodded. But you were there. You pulled me out of it. Her expression shifted, something flickering in her gaze that made his heart race. Dreams tell truth sometimes, she whispered. The days dragged on, yet each one carved something new into him. He learned the names of the herbs Mary used to brew her teas, the stories Nashoda muttered about battles and losses. He shared his own stories in return, about the ranch, about the long years of silence after his parents' deaths. Each confession felt dangerous, like laying down his weapon, but also freeing. Then came the sound. Hooves in the snow. Faint at first, then louder, circling the valley. Nashoda stiffened, moving to the entrance. Mary froze, her eyes wide. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest. Through the storm haze, figures emerged, men on horseback, their coats dark against the white. Not soldiers, ranchers. He recognized one by the yellow slicker. Dobbs. The man who had always looked at him with suspicion, the kind who thrived on cruelty. "They'll find you," Ethan whispered urgently to Mary. "You have to hide." But Nashota shook her head, her knife gleaming in the dim light. "We do not hide, we stand." Ethan's pulse thundered. He rose, reaching for his rifle. He had stumbled into their lives by accident, but now fate had drawn a line he could not retreat from. He stood by the entrance, shoulder to shoulder, with the women who had saved him as the riders closed in. The storm howled, the fire burned, and the air cracked with tension. This was no longer about survival of the body. It was about survival of the heart of trust, of a fragile bond that had formed in the eye of the storm. And Ethan knew as he chambered around into his rifle that his life would never return to what it had been before. The riders drew closer, their silhouettes looming through the swirling snow. Ethan's breath fogged the air as he tightened his grip on the rifle. The fire inside the lodge seemed like a fragile island of warmth against the encroaching storm and the menace outside. Nashota moved to the entrance, first parting the flap of hide just enough to peer out. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set. 10 men, she whispered. They circle, like wolves. Mary's hand trembled as she reached for Ethan's arm. He felt the warmth of her touch even through his coat. "What do we do?" Her voice was steady, but her dark eyes betrayed the fear she was holding back. Ethan swallowed hard. He had never faced 10 men at once. Hell, he had never faced anyone beyond the occasional drunken insult in town. Yet something burned inside him now stronger than fear. These two women had saved him, trusted him with their fire and their food. He could not let them face this alone. Outside, a voice bellowed through the storm. "Garrett, we know you're in there. Come out and maybe we'll let you live." Dobbs. Ethan knew that voice too well. Loud, cruel, full of swagger born from meanness. Nashota's lip curled. "Cowards," she muttered. "Many men against 2 women." She looked at Ethan. "And 1 boy." The word stung, but it lit something in Ethan. "Not a boy," he said, meeting her gaze. "Not anymore." The flap lifted, and he stepped out into the storm. Snow whipped against his face, stinging like needles. The riders reined their horses in a semicircle, lantern light glinting off rifle barrels. Dobbs sat at the center, grinning under his yellow slicker. Beside him was Pete Henderson, his father's son, eyes full of the same arrogance. "Look at this," Dobbs sneered. "The hermit finally crawls out of his hole. And what's he hiding with a couple of squaws?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "They saved my life," he said firmly. "They're under my protection." Laughter erupted from the men. One spat into the snow. "Under your protection, you can barely protect yourself, Garrett." Ethan raised his rifle, not aiming, but holding it ready. "This is private ground. You've no business here." "Private," Pete scoffed. "Since when does Indian ground count as private?" Mary and Nashota emerged, then standing behind Ethan. Mary held her chin high, though her hands trembled around the old rifle she carried. Nashota looked fierce, knife in one hand, her own rifle slung across her back. Dobbs leaned forward in his saddle, eyes glinting with malice. "Listen here, hermit. The town's tired of worrying about renegades. We'll take them in, or we'll take you all out." A silence fell. Snow hissed against the lantern flames. Ethan's heart pounded, but his voice rang clear. "You'll do nothing of the sort." For a heartbeat, time froze. Then a gunshot cracked the air. A bullet slammed into the snow at Dobbs's feet, close enough to send his horse rearing. Nashota's voice cut through the storm, cold and sharp as steel. "The next one finds your heart." Chaos rippled through the riders. They hadn't expected resistance. The valley mouth was narrow, rocks high and jagged on both sides, perfect ground for ambush. They shifted uneasily, glancing into the shadows, wondering if more rifles were aimed their way. "Self-defense isn't murder," another voice called from behind them. It was Ruth Miller, the widow from the neighboring ranch, her rifle steady in her hands. Beside her rode her husband Harold and young David Chen from the town's laundry. Even Jim Henderson was there, his weathered face grim. "You boys best ride home," Jim said. "Before you start something, you can't finish." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Dobbs spat into the snow. "This ain't over, Garrett. You picked your side. You'll regret it." He wheeled his horse and the others followed, muttering, cursing, but retreating into the storm. The sound of hooves faded into the blizzard, leaving only silence broken by the wind. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, his arms shaking from more than the cold. Mary touched his shoulder, her eyes wide with something between relief and awe. Nashota exhaled sharply, the knife lowering at last. Ruth Miller approached, her voice firm. You did right, Thomas. Don't let men like Dobbs tell you otherwise. You stand with them now. We all do. Jim Henderson nodded, though his eyes held worry. This will bring trouble, boy. But maybe it's time trouble met its match. As the neighbors departed, the three of them stood together in the snow. Mary slipped her hand into Ethan's, her fingers trembling but sure. Nashota's gaze softened just slightly, the hardness in her eyes easing for the first time. Not alone, Mary whispered. And Ethan, who had lived so long in silence, felt the truth of it like a fire in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. The storm still raged, but inside him, something stronger was taking root. The next morning, the valley was wrapped in silence, a deceptive calm after the storm. The snow lay thick and untouched except for the churned tracks of the riders who had threatened them only hours before. Ethan woke stiff and sore, his body reminding him of the tension that had gripped him through the night. Mary was already awake tending the fire, her long dark hair catching the glow of the embers. Nashota sat sharpening her knife, her expression unreadable. Ethan rose slowly, his breath clouding in the chill. The events of last night returned in a rush. The circle of riders, Dobbs's sneer, Ruth Miller's unexpected arrival, Jim Henderson's quiet support. He still felt the echo of fear, but beneath it burned something new: pride. He had stood his ground not as the hermit others whispered about, but as a man. Mary handed him a cup of steaming tea. You were brave, she said softly. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw warmth that nearly undid him. Without you, they would not have gone. Ethan shook his head. Without you and Nashota, I'd be dead in the snow. Without Ruth and Jim, we'd be hanging from trees this morning. He sipped the tea, its bitter taste grounding him. Bravery doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to everyone who stood against them. Nashota's eyes flicked up sharp as ever. They will return, she said flatly. Men like that never stop. They taste fear and want more. She slid the knife back into its sheath. We must prepare. The truth of her words settled heavy in the lodge. Ethan knew she was right. Last night had been a victory, but it had also painted a target on all their backs. In town, rumors would be growing like weeds. Dobbs and Pete would spread their poison, and sooner or later, the army would hear whispers of Apaches hiding in the hills. He left the lodge after breakfast, walking to where Belle stood tethered. The mare nickered softly, her breath a white plume in the cold. He stroked her neck, speaking low. We've got a fight coming, girl. Not the kind we're used to. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mary approach. She stood close, her shoulder brushing his. You could leave, she said quietly. Right away. No one would blame you. He turned sharply to her. Leave you here to face them alone? Never. His voice was firmer than he expected. I've spent 5 years hiding behind fences in silence. I won't hide anymore. Not when it matters. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she placed her hand over his, resting on Belle's mane. Their fingers intertwined without thought, and for a moment, the storm of worry eased. By afternoon, the three of them were planning. Nashota led them through the valley, pointing out natural choke points, ridges perfect for ambush, hidden paths that could be used for escape. Ethan listened, absorbing every detail. The sisters moved with the ease of those who had grown up in wild country, and he marveled at how much he had to learn. If they come again, we make them bleed, Nashota said coldly, crouching behind a boulder. Not just once. Every time until they learn fear. Ethan frowned. I don't want bloodshed. Bloodshed already chosen you, she replied sharply. Better to spill theirs than yours. Mary placed a hand on her sister's arm, calming her. We will defend ourselves, but we must also be wise. Killing too many will bring soldiers faster. The weight of their words pressed heavy on Ethan. Violence was inevitable, but it was a razor's edge. Too much, and they'd be branded outlaws. Too little, and they'd be slaughtered. That night, as the fire crackled low, Ethan found himself speaking more than he ever had in years. He told them about his father's harsh lessons, about his mother's dying words, about the loneliness that had wrapped around him like chains. Mary listened with quiet intensity, her eyes never leaving his face. Nashota listened too, though her expression remained guarded. When he finished, silence filled the lodge. Then Mary spoke. Your father was wrong. Feelings are not weakness, they are strength. Only a strong man can risk his heart. Ethan's throat tightened. Then why does it feel so terrifying? Mary's smile was soft, almost sad. Because love is the only battle worth losing. Outside, the wind moaned through the valley, carrying with it the memory of last night's confrontation. Inside, the three of them sat closer than before, united by the unspoken knowledge that their fates were now entwined. Ethan lay awake long after the sisters slept. He stared at the flickering embers, the weight of choices pressing on him. He could return to his ranch, pretend none of this mattered. Let the world swallow Mary and Nashota as it had swallowed so many others. Or he could stay, fight, risk everything for the fragile warmth they had given him. As dawn crept over the horizon, he made his choice. Word spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Ethan had barely returned to town for supplies when he heard the whispers. Men at the saloon leaning close, voices thick with suspicion. Women at the general store glancing sideways, their gossip sharper than knives. He was seen near the valley, one voice muttered. With Indians, another hissed. Two women, a third added his tone, half mockery, half disgust. Ethan kept his head down, jaw tight, as he carried a sack of flour from old Sam's counter. But he could feel their stares burning holes in his back. Once he would have ignored it, slipped away to solitude. Now he couldn't, because every whisper put Mary and Nashota in greater danger. On the porch of the saloon, Pete Henderson lounged with Dobbs, both sneering as Ethan passed. "How's life with your squaws?" Garrett Pete called loud enough for everyone to hear. Laughter followed, ugly and sharp. Ethan froze, the flour sack heavy in his arms. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Never let them see you weak." But another voice rose louder, now Mary's soft words by the fire. "Love is the only battle worth losing." He turned slowly, his eyes locking on Pete's. "They saved my life," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll not hear another word against them." The laughter faltered. Dobbs spat into the dirt. "You've gone soft, boy. This land eats men like you alive." Ethan stepped closer, his fist clenched. "Maybe it's time men like you stopped doing the eating." The tension crackled like a storm about to break. But before it could erupt, Jim Henderson's voice cut through. "Enough!" The older man strode forward, his face grim. "Pete, you shut your mouth before you say something you can't take back." Pete glared at his father, but obeyed, though his eyes promised retribution. Ethan left town quickly, his supplies loaded, but his thoughts heavy. He knew this was only the beginning. Dobbs and Pete wouldn't stop until they had blood. When he returned to the valley, Mary and Nashota were waiting by the fire. He told them everything, the whispers, the insults, Jim Henderson's intervention. Nashota's face hardened. "We must strike first," she said. "Show them we are not prey." "No," Mary countered. "If we spill blood, more will come. Soldiers, bounty hunters, men with no conscience. We must be smarter." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "Smarter how? Every day they grow bolder. Every whisper sharpens into a blade." "I can't protect you alone." "You are not alone," Mary said firmly. "There are others who see truth. Ruth Miller, Jorge, even Jim Henderson. We are not as small as you think." Her words sparked a thought. Allies, scattered, quiet, but present. If they could be gathered, if they could be united, maybe there was hope. The next days were a blur of secret meetings. Ruth Miller arrived first, her gray hair hidden beneath a scarf, her eyes fierce. "I've buried one son for hate," she said. "I'll not stand by and watch it take more." Jorge brought two of his ranch hands, silent men with scars that spoke of old battles. "We know what it means to be hunted," he said simply. Even Mrs. Chen came, her hands rough from work at the laundry, her son David beside her. "My family has known the lash of contempt," she said. "We will not watch another family suffer it." For the first time, Ethan saw it clearly. This wasn't just about his ranch or Mary or Nashota. It was about something larger, people who had been pushed aside finding the courage to stand together. Yet with hope came fear, because whispers in town had reached the army outpost. Soldiers were asking questions, riding patrols farther north. One cold evening, as snow fell thick again, Mary sat close beside Ethan. "They will come," she whispered. "You must decide now. Will you fight for us or let fear drive you away?" Ethan turned to her, seeing the firelight reflected in her eyes. "I was dead inside before I met you," he said. "You gave me life again. I'll fight until my last breath." Nashota's voice came from the shadows. "Then be ready. Dawn brings more than light. It brings war." Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of hoofbeats. The storm was coming not of snow this time, but of men and guns. And in the heart of the valley, three souls prepared to make their stand, bound by love, by blood, by the unyielding will to survive. The night before the soldiers arrived, the valley felt like it was holding its breath. The air was sharp with frost, the trees whispering in the wind, the fire in the teepee burning low. Ethan sat with Mary and Nashota, his hands wrapped around a cup of bitter tea, though it did little to warm him. "They'll come at dawn," Nashota said quietly, sharpening the blade of her knife with steady strokes. "That's when soldiers like to strike, when men are tired, when the cold cuts deepest." Mary glanced at her sister, then at Ethan. "We cannot meet them with only knives and rifles. We need more than weapons. We need wisdom." Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tight. "We can't outrun them forever. If we run, they'll chase us. If we hide, they'll find us. But if we stand—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Maybe they'll think twice." Nashota gave a bitter laugh. "Soldiers don't think twice, white man. They follow orders." Mary touched her sister's arm. "Not always. Sometimes hearts can be turned." She looked at Ethan, then her dark eyes soft but steady. "You will speak to them. You have their skin, their tongue. They will listen to you before they listen to us." The weight of her words pressed down on him. He had spent most of his life avoiding others, hiding in silence. Now his voice was their only chance. That night he barely slept. He sat awake by the fire, watching the sisters rest. Mary's head had fallen against her sister's shoulder, her braid glinting in the firelight. Nashota, even in sleep, kept her hand near the knife at her belt. They looked fragile and fierce all at once, and he felt something rise in him stronger than fear. Determination. When the first gray light of morning touched the valley, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the ridges. Ethan stood, his rifle in his hands, his heart pounding. Mary and Nashota rose behind him, ready. Out of the mist came a column of blue-coated men, their rifles gleaming, their horses snorting clouds of steam. At their head rode a tall officer with a mustache stiff as iron. He raised his hand and the column halted at the valley's edge. Garrett, the officer, called, his voice carrying. "We've had reports of fugitives, Indians off the reservation. Hand them over and no harm will come to you." Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. Mary stood beside him, her chin high. Nashota's eyes burned with defiance. "They're not fugitives," Ethan shouted back. "They're free women. They've harmed no one. They saved my life in the blizzard. You'll not take them." A murmur ran through the soldiers. The officer's face hardened. "You'd break the law for them harbor criminals?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice louder now. "The only crime here is yours. You call them criminals for living free. You call kindness rebellion. You call survival defiance. But look at them." He pointed at Mary and Nashota. "Do they look like warriors? Do they look like threats? They are women braver than any man I've ever known." Mary's hand slipped into his, steadying him. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then one of the younger soldiers shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Sarker," he muttered. "Maybe we ought to—" But the officer cut him off. "Quiet." His hand went to his revolver. "Last chance, Garrett. Stand aside." Ethan's heart thundered. He raised his rifle, though his hands shook. "You'll take them only over my dead body." Time slowed. Soldiers shifted, horses pawed at the ground. The officer's finger tightened on his trigger. Mary's breath caught. Nashota crouched low, ready to strike. And then from behind the soldiers, another voice rang out. "Enough!" Jim Henderson rode into view, his face grim. Ruth Miller and Jorge beside him, and half a dozen townsfolk following close, rifles in their hands and determination in their eyes. "These women are under our protection," Jim said firmly. "They've done no harm. If you want them, you'll have to shoot us all." The officer's eyes widened. He hadn't expected resistance, not from white settlers. "You'd side with them against your own kind." "My kind," Jim growled, "are decent folks who know right from wrong. And this here," he gestured at Mary and Nashota, "this is wrong." More murmurs rose among the soldiers. The young ones looked uncertain, their rifles lowering slightly. The officer's face turned red with rage, but he hesitated. And in that hesitation, the balance shifted. Mary stepped forward, her voice calm but strong. "Storm does not care if you are white or Apache. Cold kills all the same. We saved this man's life because it was right. Will you punish us for that?" Her words hung in the air, simple and true. The officer's jaw worked. At last, with a snarl, he shoved his revolver back into its holster. "This isn't over," he spat. He wheeled his horse and signaled his men. The column turned, retreating slowly, leaving only churned snow and the heavy silence of what might have been. As the hoofbeats faded, Ethan sagged with relief. Mary caught him before he fell. "You were brave," she whispered. "No," he said, breathless. "We were brave." And though the storm of men had passed, for now, all three of them knew it would return. But so would their courage, and so would their allies. The valley was quiet after the soldiers left. But it was the kind of quiet that carried weight, the kind that pressed on the chest and made every sound sharper. Ethan sat by the fire, his hands trembling, though he tried to hide it. Mary placed a blanket around his shoulders, her dark eyes searching his face. "You spoke well," she said softly. "Your words made some of them think." Ethan shook his head. "Maybe for a moment, but words don't stop bullets. The captain will be back. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next week, but he won't forget what happened." Nashota knelt by the fire, feeding it dry twigs. The sparks leapt like restless spirits. "Then let him come. We will be ready. No more running." The next few days, the valley became a place of constant preparation. Jim Henderson returned with supplies. Ruth Miller sent word that more townsfolk were quietly on their side, and Jorge brought 2 young vaqueros who knew how to fight in the hills. Mary and Nashota taught Ethan tricks of moving silently, of listening to the wind for signs of riders. But tension grew heavier with every sunrise. Every bird that startled, every distant hoofbeat made them flinch. At night, Ethan often lay awake staring at the canvas above, listening to Mary's slow breathing beside him. The warmth of her presence steadied him, yet fear coiled inside. One evening, as the sun bled red over the snow, Sarah Nashota stood watching the horizon. "They'll strike when we are weakest," she murmured. "Not with soldiers, maybe. With men who hide behind darkness and lawless rage." Her words proved true. It happened 3 nights later. The air was so cold it cracked like glass. Ethan had just finished checking bell when he heard it, the faint crunch of boots in snow where no one should be. His hand went to his rifle and he scanned the dark tree line. Shadows moved 5, maybe 6 men, their steps careful, their breath white in the moonlight. No uniforms, vigilantes. Before he could call out, a torch arced through the air and landed against the side of the lean-to. Flames licked upward, devouring dry wood. "Fire!" Ethan shouted, grabbing a bucket of snow and throwing it at the blaze. Mary rushed out, her braids swinging, Nashota already drawing her bow. Arrows hissed into the night, one striking a man's leg. He cried out, tumbling into the snow. Gunfire cracked, loud and brutal, against the quiet valley. Sparks flew as bullets struck stone. Ethan pulled Mary behind a boulder, his heart pounding. "Stay down." But Mary shook free, her face fierce. "No! If we hide, we die!" She raised her rifle, firing into the dark. A scream answered. The fight raged in flashes of firelight and gunpowder. Ethan fired until the barrel grew hot, his ears ringing with each shot. Nashota moved like a shadow, loosing arrows, then vanishing into the rocks. Mary reloaded with steady hands, her face pale but resolute. For every man they drove back, another crept closer. The flames threatened to spread, lighting the valley like a beacon. "We can't hold forever," Ethan gasped, blood running from a graze on his arm. "Then we hold until dawn," Nashota answered grimly. "Light is friend, darkness is theirs." But dawn was hours away. Just as hope began to fray, a horn sounded from the ridge. A lantern swung high and voices rose, familiar voices. Jim Henderson and his men rushing down the slope with rifles ready. Ruth Miller was there, too small but fierce, wielding a shotgun that looked half her size. The vigilantes broke. Some fled into the trees, others dropped their weapons, retreating into the dark. Within minutes, the valley was silent again, save for the hiss of dying fire and the ragged sound of breathing. Ethan collapsed to his knees, exhausted. Mary knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his. "You see," she whispered, "we are not alone." But the attack had left more than smoke and blood in its wake. It left a truth none of them could ignore. This was only the beginning. Hatred would return, fiercer than before. Nashota wiped soot from her face, her eyes blazing. "They will come again. Next time, more men, more guns. And we must decide now. Fight until nothing is left, or find another way." Ethan looked at Mary, at the woman who had become his heart, and then at Nashota, who had become his sister in spirit. His voice was hoarse but steady. "We will not run. But we can't just fight with bullets. We need allies. We need to build something stronger than their hate. Mary touched his cheek, her hand trembling. Then let us build it, together. And as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, painting the valley in fragile gold, Ethan realized that the real battle was not only for survival, it was for the right to belong, to live, to love against a world determined to tear them apart. The valley bore scars of the night battle. Blackened wood still smoked from the burned lean-to. Blood stained the snow in dark patches, and the acrid smell of gunpowder lingered long after the men had fled. Ethan stood among the ruins, his rifle heavy in his hands, his breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. Mary and Nashota worked side by side, repairing what could be saved. Their faces were streaked with soot, but their movements were steady, deliberate, as if refusing to let despair take root. Ruth Miller bustled about with surprising strength for her age, directing Jim Henderson's men to drag away debris. "They'll come again," Jim said grimly, his hat pulled low over his weathered face. "Dobbs won't forgive being beaten. Men like him only get meaner when humiliated." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we'll be ready. But we can't just keep defending this valley with a handful of rifles. We need something more." Ruth's sharp eyes flicked to him. "More what? More guns, more blood, or more people willing to stand for what's right?" Her words struck him like a hammer. The fight couldn't just be about outshooting their enemies. It had to be about building something that outlasted fear. That evening, as the fire cast a warm glow inside the teepee, Ethan gathered Mary and Nashota close. "We can't live like this," he said, voice low but urgent, "waiting for the next attack, hiding every time we hear hoofbeats. We need a community, allies, people who see us not as white or Apache, but as neighbors." Nashota frowned. "Neighbors are the ones who bring torches." "Some?" "Yes," Ethan admitted, "but not all. Jim, Ruth, Georgie. They stood with us. There are others. I've heard whispers in town, people who are tired of Dobbs and his kind, who want something better. If we can bring them together, maybe we can make this valley more than a hiding place." Mary's eyes softened, her hand resting over his. "A home." The word hung in the air, fragile but powerful. The next weeks tested them like never before. Winter pressed hard, food grew scarce, and every sound beyond the valley walls made their hearts race. Yet slowly, almost impossibly, threads of hope began to weave a new pattern. Jorge brought 2 families of vaqueros to settle near the stream, building small cabins and offering their skills in exchange for safety. Ruth convinced a group of Quaker families traveling west to stay, promising them land and community. Even Jim Henderson, torn between loyalty to his blood and his conscience, began sending supplies quietly, though he knew it risked his reputation. The valley transformed. Smoke from new chimneys rose against the cold sky. Laughter of children echoed where once there had been only silence. The air carried not just the scent of firewood and stew, but the hum of life refusing to be snuffed out. Yet shadows lingered. At night, Ethan still woke sweating, replaying the moment when Dobbs's men had set fire to the valley. Nashota slept with her bow, close, her ears tuned for danger. Mary often stared into the fire, her thoughts heavy, though she rarely spoke them aloud. One evening, Ethan found her sitting by the spring, the moonlight silver on her braid. He sat beside her, the cold seeping through his coat, and waited. "You believe this can last?" she asked finally. "I want to believe," he said. "But belief alone won't keep us safe. We have to make it last. We have to fight for it, not just with rifles, but with everything we are." She leaned against him, her breath misting in the night air. "My mother used to say roots must grow deep before flowers can bloom. Maybe we are planting roots now." The next morning, Ruth Miller brought news from town. Dobbs was spreading lies, claiming Ethan was harboring not just 2 Apache women, but an entire tribe of renegades. "He's whipping up fear," she warned. "He'll push the army, or worse, bring his own mob again." The council that night was unlike anything Ethan had known. Around the fire sat Quakers, vaqueros, freedmen, Chinese laborers and ranchers willing to risk everything. Their faces were lined with weariness and worry, but their voices carried determination. "We can't hide," Jorge said firmly. "Every time we hide, they grow bolder. We must show them this valley stands together." "How?" Ethan asked. "A handful of cabins and a schoolhouse won't stop rifles?" "No," Ruth countered, "but courage might. If enough of us stand, if enough of us say this is home, even the army will think twice before tearing it apart." Silence followed, heavy with the weight of choice. Then Mary spoke, her voice clear, steady. "Storm does not care if you are white or Apache. Cold kills all same. But warmth, shared fire, shared food, that is what keeps us alive. We are alive together. That is worth any risk. Eyes turned to her and something shifted in the circle. Resolve hardened. They were no longer just families clinging to survival. They were becoming something larger, a community. Yet deep inside, Ethan knew Ruth was right. Dobbs would not rest. The army would not ignore rumors forever. And when the storm came again, it would be fiercer than anything they had faced. As the fire burned low and the council dispersed, Ethan stayed behind with Mary and Nashota. The night was still, but his heart pounded with the enormity of what lay ahead. "We've started something," he said quietly. "Something bigger than us. But if it fails..." Nashota cut him off, her gaze unyielding. "Then we fail fighting for life, not hiding from it." Mary took his hand, her touch warm against the cold. "And if it succeeds, Ethan, if it truly succeeds, then maybe we change more than just this valley. Maybe we change hearts." The three of them sat in silence, the stars wheeling above the fire glowing between them. And in that fragile, defiant quiet, Ethan felt it the beginning of a new story, one written not by fear but by hope, sharpened into courage. Dawn crept over the valley with a pale light, but instead of peace it brought the sound of hooves, many hooves. Ethan was already awake, pacing the edge of camp when the first riders appeared on the horizon. His stomach tightened. This was no small raiding party. The dust cloud behind them told of dozens of men, and among them he caught the glint of military uniforms. The army had come, and with them Dobbs and his followers eager for blood. Mary emerged from the teepee with her shawl drawn tight, her eyes finding his. She didn't ask questions. She could see the truth in his face. Nashota strode up bow, slung across her back, jaw set like stone. "It's time," she said simply. Within minutes, the valley stirred to life. Families rushed children into the schoolhouse, its stout log walls the safest shelter they had. Men and women took up rifles, bows, even farming tools sharpened into weapons. Ruth Miller barked orders with the authority of a general, while Jim Henderson rode forward to join Ethan at the ridge. "They'll try to make this quick," Jim muttered. "Show force, scatter us with fear. But we've got the high ground. If we hold, maybe we can buy enough time." The riders halted at the mouth of the valley. Dobbs pushed forward, sneer twisting his face. Beside him, Captain Harrow of the U.S. Cavalry raised a hand for silence. His voice carried cold authority. "By order of the territorial governor, any Indians found outside the reservation are to be returned. Surrender them now and the rest of you may go free." Ethan stepped forward, rifle slung, but ready. "These women are not fugitives. They are my family. They have as much right to live here as any of us." A murmur rippled through the defenders behind him. Mary stood tall at his side, her presence as defiant as any rifle. Dobbs spat in the snow. "Your family, hell, Garrett. You're a disgrace. Hand 'em over or we'll take 'em. And when we do, we'll burn this valley to ash." Captain Harrow's hand twitched, but he didn't rebuke Dobbs. It was clear enough where his sympathies lay. Ethan's voice rang out louder than he thought possible. "We will not run. We will not surrender. If you mean to take them, you'll have to take all of us." Ruth Miller rode up beside him, her gray hair whipping in the wind. "That's right. This valley stands together. We've buried enough sons for your wars and your hate. No more." The defenders raised their rifles in unison, a ragtag but resolute army. Fear prickled Ethan's skin, but under it pulsed something fiercer, pride. For a long moment the standoff held. Then Dobbs drew his revolver, bellowing, "Kill them all." Chaos erupted. Shots cracked, arrows whistled smoke, and shouting filled the valley. The defenders fired from behind rocks and logs, their knowledge of the terrain giving them precious advantage. Sarah's rifle barked from the ridge, dropping a rider before he could spur forward. Jorge's vaqueros wheeled their horses like dancers, harrying the flanks. Ethan fired until his rifle was empty, then drew his revolver, the recoil jolting through his arm. Men screamed. Horses reared, the clash of battle thundered like a storm. In the thick of it he saw Mary, her shawl cast aside, her rifle steady, her eyes blazing. She fought not with hatred, but with fierce protective love. Every shot she fired was a vow, we will not be erased. But the army pressed harder. Disciplined lines advanced, pushing the defenders back. Ethan's breath burned in his lungs as he reloaded, desperation clawing at him. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Then a horn sounded from the east. Heads turned. Another wave of riders approached, but these bore no weapons. They carried tools, banners, families, Quakers, freedmen, townsfolk who had chosen to stand with the valley. Behind them trudged wagons laden with supplies, their presence a declaration louder than any gun. "This valley is ours," Ruth cried, her voice carrying across the field. "We will live free or not at all." Something shifted then. The soldiers hesitated, caught between orders and the undeniable sight of settlers, women and children standing beside the Apache sisters. Captain Harrow barked commands, but fewer men obeyed. Doubt fractured their ranks. Dobbs, furious, charged forward, revolver raised. Ethan saw him coming, time slowing. He thought of the long nights, the laughter by the fire, the fragile dream they'd built. He thought of Mary's hand in his, of Sarah's quiet strength, of the children's voices ringing in the schoolhouse. He fired. The shot struck Dobbs squarely, knocking him from his saddle. Silence rippled out as the self-appointed leader of hate hit the ground motionless. The battle broke then. Some soldiers retreated in confusion, others lowering their rifles entirely. Captain Harrow cursed, but even he seemed to realize the tide had turned. With no clear enemy left to justify further bloodshed, the cavalry pulled back, dragging their wounded. When the dust settled, the valley still stood, battered, bloodied, but unbroken. Ethan sank to his knees, chest-heaving, tears hot in his eyes. Mary knelt beside him, cupping his face with trembling hands. "We are alive," she whispered. "Against all odds, we are alive." Around them, defenders embraced, wept, laughed with the raw relief of survival. Children spilled from the schoolhouse, running to their parents. Ruth Miller leaned on her rifle, eyes bright with unshed tears. Nashota stood above them, all her silhouette framed against the dawn light. Her voice carried calm and strong. "This valley has seen blood today, but let it also see rebirth. We will not live as ghosts. We will live as people." Ethan rose, pulling Mary into his arms. Together they looked out over the valley, their valley. No longer just a refuge, but a promise carved in courage and bound in love. The sun broke fully over the mountains, then gilding the smoke and scars with gold. And for the first time, Ethan believed the future was more than survival. It was life. It was family. It was hope.